Hi, Joel. My name is Allison. I'm 36 years old, and at the end of 2018, I decided to start my own business. You can call it basic if you want, but I've always been passionate about cutting and styling hair. I was the oldest of 6 girls, and we grew up in a very poor household, so not only did I have to learn to cut hair, but I needed to get good at it if I was going to keep myself and my sisters from being the laughingstock of the whole town. It was a skill I continued to practice until way into my high school and college years, but it wasn't a passion so much as a in-demand skill that I had. It was only years later when I started working in an office environment that I started to realize how much I really missed it. By the time I was an adult, my sisters, friends, and coworkers could all afford to go to professional stylists, so I just wasn't being pestered to do it anymore. For a while, it was a relief, but after 18 months working in mind-numbing, boring office job stuff, I was starting to lose my mind. Now, long story short, I realized that I actually missed cutting people's hair, and that I actually enjoyed the process of it. It wasn't so much the actual cutting and styling, although it is kind of therapeutic once you know what you're doing. It's how happy a good haircut makes a person, regardless of their age or gender. Something so small can make someone's whole day, make them feel like the best version of themselves. Sure, it wasn't curing cancer or anything like that, but it was a way to make people feel good about themselves while making enough money to build towards a brick-and-mortar business. Suddenly, I went from being a despairing commuter to an excited young entrepreneur, and over the next year or so, my business continued to grow and thrive. I specialized in home visits, which more often than not involve folks that can't otherwise get to a salon or barber. That means a lot of older and disabled folks on end-of-life care. Maybe only 1 in 10 of my clients was some wealthy suburbanite who wanted the convenience of a home visit. Most others didn't have the choice. But then, the big pandemic hit, and my business was hit hard. Thankfully, I didn't have too much overhead at that stage, which meant that I didn't go bankrupt, and I was also lucky enough to have a means of supplementing my income. A friend told me about an agency who organized cleaning staff for office buildings and serviced apartments, and with the demand for deep cleaning going through the roof, there was plenty of work to go around. The company was super sketchy, mostly paid in cash, and you had to buy all of your own equipment, but money was money, and boy did I need it. So, almost every morning for nearly a whole year, I showed up at some dingy little office in the north end of town and was given a handful of addresses that I needed to visit, then went off either alone or in a group to clean wherever needed cleaning. Probably as some way of scamming the IRS, this company treated us as private contractors and paid us by the square foot. But then if you actually got a largest apartment all to yourself to clean, you could actually make quite a lot of money in just a few hours of work. It wasn't almost as much as I had been making as a stylist, but it was what I needed to survive until I could follow my dreams again. So one day, I showed up at the office, got my jobs for the day, then headed off in my car to the first address. First 2 jobs were kind of small, but then when I arrived at the third address, I found it was way bigger than the other 2. Considering the neighborhood it was in, I should have known the building would be as fancy as it was, but I was still taken aback when I actually saw the place. The penthouse suites at the top looked like they cost more money than I'd ever make in 2 lifetimes, and even the lobby looked like it could have been a fancy hotel. I had to introduce myself to a doorman just to get inside the place, and then once I was inside, another employee offered to guide me to the floor in the elevator. His name tag said Carl. He was a real nice guy, and we chatted on the ride up as I wondered who might actually live in a place like this. That question stayed with me long after I should have forgotten about that third apartment. Back then, I'd have killed to know which actors or sports stars actually lived there. But now, I don't think that I do want to know what kind of people call that place home. We went all the way up to the 5th floor, but these places were walk-up apartments, so the building was way taller than that suggests, and the apartments were huge. I was given a temporary keycard by one of the staff, and after using it to open up the apartment that I was set to clean, my jaw just dropped to the floor. It was the single most opulent, luxurious living place that I'd ever witnessed with my own eyes. And it was trashed, and it did not smell good. It looked like someone had thrown the party of the century in that place, the kind of party only stupidly rich people could throw. There were empty bottles of champagne everywhere, All kinds of fancy little snack things just going bad on countertops. There were even, clothes all over the place, too. Odd items at first, then more revealing things, all leading me to believe that, for some folks, it had been a very wild party. Usually the tenant leaves some kind of note detailing what they wanted clean, but his place had nothing, and the agency didn't mention anything special about a party that I needed to clean up after. I know this sounds like a nightmare, but it wasn't. I could just take a few pictures on my phone, spend all day cleaning the place, then take home a lot more money in hourly pay than I would have done otherwise. Sure, I'd no doubt encounter some pretty gross surprises in the process, but I was in dire need of the cash, and such a huge mess presented a pretty gross but super lucrative opportunity for me. So, I took my pictures, sent them over to the agency oh no, I'm gonna be here all day, then got to work cleaning the place. I remember thinking how that party must have been wild. Every empty bottle was some sort of bougie liquor or beer, and there was a lot of evidence of hard drug use, and almost everything that had once been in a shelf, in a box, or in a cabinet had either been knocked over or straight up tossed on the floor. I remember seeing dozens of little glass chess pieces, a few of them chipped from where folks had stood on or kicked them. They must have been worth hundreds of dollars, but there they were, all smashed and damaged, like replacing them was just no big deal. The kitchen was similarly trashed as the living area, and that's when I realized that the party hadn't taken place the previous night, or the night before that, or any other time in the previous week. There was all this super old-looking party food laid on the countertops, and it was all so rotten that it was literally festering. I mean, things were moving around in some of these moldy blobs that used to be canopies, and I realized what the bad smell was. I'm not exactly the squeamish type, but the smell was so god-awful that it had me gagging for a second. And thank God I had 2 masks on at the time, and I put both of them on before tackling that hot mess. But even with 2 masks, I could still smell all that rot, and I swear a lesser woman would have puked more than once getting it all into trash bags. Everything had been relatively normal up until that point. Well, as normal as you could get for the disgusting aftermath of some glitzy party. But they only started to get really weird when I opened up the refrigerator. Inside were yet more bottles of booze, either unopened or corked, and a bunch more of those fancy little hors d'oeuvres things, considerably less decayed than the unrefrigerated stuff. But what really caught my attention was the little cardboard tray that looked very familiar to me. I had a friend back in middle school who used to be a diabetic, and she kept all of her insulin in this little fridge in miniature glass bottles. I understand the technology is very different these days, and most folks use a special pen, but back in the day, her parents had to load up an actual syringe from a glass bottle. I know whatever was in that plastic tray was some kind of medicine or drug, but I have no idea which one. It sure didn't say insulin on any of those bottles, but being a familiar concept, I didn't find it all that suspicious. Someone at the party probably had some kind of medical condition and needed medication on hand for it. I mean, it's a simple enough explanation, right? But what didn't have a simple explanation were the Polaroid pictures scattered all over the apartment. They all depicted the various antics of the night before, and as raucous as the aftermath might have made the party seem, the pictures made it look kind of wholesome. They showed what looked like a lot of old friends drinking and dancing and smiling and laughing. But then, as I started to find more and more of them during the second phase of cleaning, it was almost like you could pinpoint the moment when things started getting weird. Keep in mind that I was finding these at random. It wasn't like an old-style flip book or a photo album or anything like that. But the more I found, the more I was able to piece together what the party looked like as the night went on. I started seeing a lot of drug use in the pictures, all kinds of stuff too, and the more people took, the more that happy look in their eyes got replaced with something a little darker. People started to look meaner, lewder, even scary. I guess at some point people started to dress up in costumes because I started seeing a lot of folks wearing all kinds of different masks, you know what I mean? And some of them were really pretty expensive looking too. But then some of them were so ugly and demonic looking that they just gave me the creeps, really. I then found a few shots of a girl crying. Not unusual at a big messy party like that, but still upsetting to see. I found another photo where it looked like someone was trying to comfort her, but then, on closer inspection, I think they were actually laughing in the girl's face. I tossed that one into the trash bag that I was holding with contempt, realizing that I was cleaning up after some real jerks. Dumb teenagers making a mess like that is understandable, but there was something different about these people. There was something wrong with them. I tried not to look at any more of the Polaroids as I cleaned the rest of the ground floor, and it took me about 4 hours to actually get the place good as new. I took a little break, went to get lunch, and then came back renewed to get started on the second floor. I decided to take my time with it too, because whatever waited for me up there had to be way worse than what I'd already cleaned downstairs. Arriving back, I swapped a little small talk with the employees, put on a podcast once I was back in the apartment, then walked to the stairs to face the music. I figured that it'd be bad up there, and God, was I right. The bathroom was in just this disgusting condition. There was no poop at all, thankfully, but there was a lot of other stuff that I didn't feel comfortable being anywhere near without a pair of very thick rubber gloves. I decided to swallow the frog, as they say, and get the bathroom cleaned up first before I moved on to both the master and guest bedrooms. It was gag-worthy, and I realized that I'd made a terrible decision to eat lunch before tackling it first, but I powered through and got her done before moving on to the guest bedroom. Upon walking into the guest room, I knew that there had been some type of bad juju going on there the night before. There were all these gross-looking toys all over the room, empty baggies next to the bed, and there was broken wine glasses on the floor next to what looked like a few flecks of blood, honestly. It looked like an accident, but then there was just a bunch of other stuff in the room that gave me really bad vibes and made me think that something else might have happened. And that's about the same time that I noticed that one of the toys wasn't quite like the others. It was carved out of wood, with these sharp, jagged edges on all sides, and the design carved into it showed scenes that looked like they could be depictions of hell. It was always an irrational fear of mine that I was going to clean up evidence of some kind of crime. Not like a pool of blood or anything like that, but fibers or other DNA or something. And here I had actual blood in a bedroom after some wild party, and thinking about it made me more suspicious by the second. I decided to not clean anything else until I checked the master bedroom. I felt a smidgen overdramatic as I did it, don't get me wrong, but I went ahead and did it anyways. The first thing I noticed about the master bedroom is that it actually looked like it had been spared most of the chaos elsewhere. I guess the homeowner was smart enough to lock the door or something else, because aside from the bed having been used for God knows what, the only mess I could see were a bunch of Polaroids scattered all around the room. I was low-key relieved to see that there wasn't a dead body in there, and also relieved that there seemed to be very little the way of trash to clear up. It seemed like the bloodstain was just an accident, and that I might actually be out of that place sooner than expected. So before I headed down for some hydrogen peroxide for the bloodstain in the guest room, I figured that I'd pick up the Polaroids and straighten up the bed so I could just tick off the master bedroom as being cleaned. Thing is, I didn't finish cleaning that big fancy apartment. I didn't even finish with the master bedroom, because after I picked up the first couple of Polaroids, and the picture began to build of what had happened in that room, everything changed, and it changed fast. Remember I told you about the girl who was crying in the pictures downstairs, and then how it looked like some idiot was just laughing at her? It's the same girl as in the photographs from the bedroom, and she's still crying, only she's surrounded by some of the same masked creeps from the Polaroid I saw downstairs. They're touching her, grabbing her, pulling her hair in some pictures, and she went from upset to looking downright terrified in just a few pictures. I found another Polaroid where it looked like a few of the masked men were dragging her somewhere. She was all blurry where I guess she was just struggling, and I recognized the furniture from the master bedroom, so I knew that it must have been taken almost right where I was standing. I frantically started to sift through the rest of the Polaroids, arranging them on the bed to try and find out what happened to the crying girl after the masked men grabbed her. Slowly but surely, I found the photos that I needed, and I felt sick when I worked out what they'd done to her. It was all in still frames, not much to go on, but her fate was painfully clear. The guys in the masks had dragged her over to an open closet, Then I audibly gasped as I saw them force her into the small-looking trunk. There wasn't a picture of them actually closing or locking the thing, but they must have had to fold her up like an origami if she was actually going to fit in there. But then the next thing, I'm finding a Polaroid of the trunk, closed and padlocked, presumably with the girl still inside. And that's when I realized that I was standing right in front of the same closet shown in the photos, and after reaching out with a shaking hand, I opened it up, praying that locked trunk wouldn't be waiting for me on the other side. But it was, and it broke me. I remember just running to the apartment's plug-in phone, but I couldn't work out how to call down to the desk, so I ended up running to the elevator and hammering the G button, then almost having a panic attack on the way down, hyperventilating. I burst into the lobby shouting, "Bolt cutters, call the cops, I need bolt cutters and 911. The bolt cutters were locked up in the janitorial closet, but one of the building staff had a claw hammer that he kept around for minor repairs, so he grabbed that and went back up to the apartment to smash the padlock off the trunk. Watching the guy smash the lock off felt like it lasted forever. I mean, I know whoever was in there probably wasn't alive. They must have been in there for days, but there was always still a chance that they were still there, still a chance we could bring them back from the brink of death. After showing him the Polaroids, we were both calling out, "Hello, are you still alive? Hello?" But there was no response from inside the box. I could tell from the way that it was moving that there was still something inside, but it sounded dry as it shifted around inside. Finally, the padlock's metal link popped off after one of the guy's strikes, and I braced myself for whatever we were about to find inside. When the guy swung open the lid, I caught a quick glimpse of folded-up limbs before I covered my eyes and turned away. I expected the employee I was with to do the same, but his reaction wasn't as anything like I'd expected it to be. Instead of a horrified, "Oh my God," or anything like that, he just sounded confused. I turned back and saw that it wasn't a dead body that had been cramped up in the trunk. It was pieces of a mannequin, all picked apart and separated. We had to double-check the Polaroids to make sure that we'd seen the girl getting forced into the trunk, and we did. But then they must have let her out before tossing the broken-up mannequin in there. I can't tell you how much relief that was, but we were both still so shaken up from the panic that it hardly seemed like a moment to celebrate. We knew we had to get out of there to preserve whatever was left of any forensic evidence, and the employee called the cops right away when we got back down to the lobby. I figured that I should stick around to tell them what I saw, but I waited almost an hour afterwards and no one showed up. In the end, I had to leave before the cleaning agency's office closed, otherwise I wouldn't be able to collect my money until the following morning. But I gave the employee my contact details before I left, expecting the cops to be in touch soon, because why wouldn't they investigate something so messed up? But then, one day went, and then another, and then another, until I realized the cops weren't going to call. I even stopped by the building to talk to the employees, but the doorman wouldn't let me in without a good reason. I then called the front desk from my phone and asked if the nice man that I dealt with was still there. Carl came to the phone, and as much as it was great to hear his voice, the news wasn't good. He'd called the cops a second time after I left, and once again they assured him that they'd send someone along to take a look. But just like the first time we called, Carl waited, and no one showed. He then brought the whole thing up to the building manager, who basically told him he'd be fired if he didn't stop harassing tenants. It was Carl who told me that I should probably just let the whole thing go. It was just a crazy party thrown by some dumb rich idiots who didn't really lock a girl in a trunk for a few weeks, even though it really did look that way. I started to think that maybe he was right, that maybe I was just stressed about money and had overreacted. I mean, seeing how people could just waste money like that, maybe it got to me subconsciously and I just wanted to paint them as bad people. I could have probably convinced myself of that if I hadn't seen the Polaroids, if I hadn't seen the tears and the terror of that girl's face. Part of me just knows that they kept her in there long enough that even if she did get out alive, she wouldn't be the same again. Whoever owns that apartment likes trapping people in small spaces. It's like their thing, you know? And that's why they keep that mannequin in there. I had a crazy thought once, thinking that the partygoers were a cult that had used magic to turn that poor girl into a mannequin. That sounds like something a hacky horror writer might dream up. But on the other hand, a very rich individual using their money and influence to live out their sadistic fantasies away from prying eyes. I don't think there's anything remotely unrealistic about that, do you? I don't know if any of y'all will find this scary or whatever, but for me, I think this made for one of the scariest, soul-crushing thoughts of my whole life. Many years ago now, I had to head over to my grandmother's place to help her clean up. She was getting on a little, and although she seemed as sharp as she ever was, she was having a few mobility issues, so we used to help her clean her place and cook for herself. Being one of the better cooks among us, I tended to stick to making her meals with my husband, and brother-in-law took to cleaning the house. So it was me that started to notice that certain pots and pans kept going missing every week. I brought it up with Grandma, asking where all of her pots and pans were going, but she told me that she didn't know, and offered me money to buy her new ones. I do just that, but then as the weeks go by, those pots and pans go missing too. Next thing we know, hubby can smell a weird burnt smell outside the guest room, and when he looks in, there are all the pots and pans, but burned right off them. Grandma was going senile, and she was putting things on to cook or boil or what have you, then just forgetting about them. And then she was so scared of us finding out, she didn't put them in the trash, but was also incapable of thinking of a good hiding place, so she just tossed them in the guest room. Grandma was scared. She was scared of losing her mind, and she didn't want to address it. And because Grandma was scared, I got scared for her. I got scared for myself too, wondering if I was going to end up sitting in a chair all day, staring into space and drooling while trying to remember who I am. Or if Grandma was going to end up like that, and how it was going to break my heart to have to explain who I was to her at the start of every single visit. What followed was very emotional for all involved. It wasn't a discussion Mom wanted to have, and because of that, it turned into a confrontation that ended in tears. Sad tears. Tears of despair even, but at least we could cry them together, and not alone. After my grandma died, my dad enlisted mine and my brother's help to clean out her place. Growing up on a North Carolina farm, she was able to take French in high school, apparently because my great-grandparents insisted on it being available in the local school to give the kids a sense of culture. Turns out, her French class did a bunch of correspondence exchanges with other French-speaking countries, and Grandma managed to get herself a pen pal in France who was about the same age. Their letters seemed real cute, and I don't speak a lot of French, but I knew enough to work out roughly what they were saying. And then I saw the dates, spring and summer of 1940, and I realized Grandma's pen pal was writing from northeastern France. Around the summer, I started seeing mentions of war, and then in the last letter my grandma received, I read the words in French, which translated to, "The Germans are very close now." And that was the last letter. The last one we found, anyway. It still gives me chills to think about my grandma having to deal with that as a kid. Back in 2015, 66-year-old Sumio Sanaga disappeared from his hometown of Katsugai, Japan. He had been living with his two siblings in the country's southern Aichi prefecture and was not considered to be at risk. So instead of immediately reporting Sumio missing, his siblings waited until the following year to inform authorities of his disappearance. A preliminary search of the surrounding area yielded no clues to Sumio's whereabouts, and despite extensive interviews with friends and neighbors, the investigation into his disappearance made little progress. For 5 long years, Sumio's siblings left his bedroom untouched. They claimed to have taken a brief look through his belongings, but found no clue to his location among them. For a while, they held out hope for his safe return, but as the years went by, their hope dwindled, and they began to accept that Sumio wasn't coming home. Finally, after more than half a decade, Sumio's brother and sister accepted that their big brother was gone and decided to clear out his bedroom. Sumio had been something of a hoarder, and his siblings were faced with a Herculean task in cleaning out his room, but after arming themselves with a veritable arsenal of disinfectants, they entered his bedroom and got to work. Yet almost immediately they were faced with a truly horrifying sight. Lying on the floor, out of sight of the room's doorway, was a human skeleton. Sumio's siblings immediately contacted the police and were horrified to discover that it belonged to their missing brother. They had been completely oblivious to the fact that they had been living in the same house as their brother's corpse for 5 long years. Yet puzzlingly, the Sanaga house was very small, even by Japanese standards. It seems impossible 2 people could live in a place like that without detecting the stench of decomposing flesh. It was also extremely suspicious that Sumio's siblings hadn't discovered his body during the initial search of his bedroom. They claimed to have gone through Sumio's belongings, searching for clues to his disappearance. These belongings had been strewn all over his bedroom, so how they failed to spot his corpse during this search is nothing short of baffling. When it was discovered that Sumio had passed away of natural causes, his siblings were essentially cleared of all suspicion. But as many investigators have pointed out, this doesn't exactly preclude their involvement. You see, Sumio Sanaga was actually the owner of the home, and it was no secret that the 3 siblings resented having to share such a small space. There's a good chance that Sumio's brother and sister knew he was suffering from some kind of life-threatening medical problem, and they certainly would have heard him hit the floorboards when he collapsed. Detectives began to suspect that Sumio's siblings simply allowed their older brother to die, possibly as a means of freeing up more room in the house. There was also evidence that Sumio's corpse had been tampered with, as his skeleton lay in a position that detectives felt was unnatural. Given that it was found naked, some began to speculate that Sumio's body had been stripped of clothing, either before or after his death, simply as a means of saving money on new clothes. It's also believed that once they allowed their brother to die, Sumio's siblings realized that the funeral would be very costly. So to save expenses, they could just let him decompose in his bedroom, then dispose of whatever remained in the future once it was easier to deal with. It made for a very preposterous allegation, and it was extremely unlikely that a Japanese court would convict Sumio's brothers of any kind of crime. They staunchly denied allowing their brother to die, claiming that only those with the blackest of hearts could simply stand by and listen to their loved one expire. Yet shockingly, Japan has a long and storied history of such things, so much so that the murder or abandonment of the elderly has its own special name. The word obuste translates to abandoning old woman, but the practice is also referred to as obuste or oyoste, which means to abandon a parent. Legend has it that in times gone by, elderly people of a variety of cultures were forced to sacrifice themselves so as not to be a burden on their friends and families. In ancient Japan, the elderly and infirm were sometimes carried to a mountain or some other remote, desolate place, then left there to die. The practice apparently stems from an ancient Buddhist folktale in which a son carries his mother up a mountain on his back. During the journey, she stretches out her arms, catching the twigs and scattering them in their wake, so that her son will be able to find the way home. The story was commemorated in the following poem. In the depths of the mountain, whom was it for the aged mother snapped, one twig after another? Heedless of herself, she did so, for the sake of her son. According to the Kodansha Illustrated Encyclopedia of Japan, uba-stay is the subject of legend but does not seem ever to have been a common custom. However, the train station in Nagano Prefecture is named after the practice, and one of the largest mountains in the same region has been nicknamed Uba-stay Yama, which directly translates to Mountain of Abandoned Old Women. Japanese historians have attempted to downplay the role that uba-stay has played in Japanese society, but it seems highly unlikely that a place would earn such a nickname unless the practice was commonplace, at least at one point in time. It certainly seems to have entered the Japanese national consciousness, enough so that Sumio's siblings would see it fit to abandon him during his time of need. It hardly seems important whether it was a sense of tradition and honor that led Sumio to rot in his own bedroom, or simply callousness and greed. But the horrifying fact is that when he needed them most, Sumio's siblings, people he'd been close to for his whole adult life, simply chose to let him die, cold and alone, more of a burden than a brother. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Torrevieja is a small resort town near the eastern Spanish city of Alicante. It's a major hub for international tourism, with just 80,000 year-round residents welcoming over 500,000 visitors every single year. Like most other Spanish resort towns, Torrevieja is home to a number of expats, people who pack up their lives in their home countries to start new ones in often sunnier climates. Only around 60% of the year-round residents are Spanish, and the rest are a smattering of English, German, Swedish, Eastern European, and South Americans. The eclectic mix of languages and cultures certainly makes for a diverse cultural tableau, but as local law enforcement will tell you, it can present a number of obstacles to criminal investigations. Each cultural enclave can be deeply protective of its own, and detectives have described being met with impenetrable walls of silence during their work. In that kind of environment, lawlessness can survive, and that puts everyday people in a great deal of danger. On July 16th of 2020, a 58-year-old cleaning lady was working in an apartment building on Torrevieja's Pascual Street. It was just before 7 o'clock in the evening, and the woman had almost finished her shift at the apartment block. Yet just before she was due to depart, a young man walked into the building and changed her life forever. Without saying a word, the man grabbed her by the neck, punched her in the face, then stabbed her repeatedly in the shoulders and the back of the neck. Luckily, her screams of terror alerted one of the apartment building's residents, who came rushing to her aid. This resident managed to scare off the attacker, but despite being brave enough to chase him down the street, the attacker managed to escape. Emergency services rushed to the scene of the attack, and thankfully, none of the cleaning lady's injuries proved life-threatening, but even so, the damage had been devastating. She suffered a broken nose along with 20 stab wounds her attacker had inflicted, and given that some of these were to the rear of her neck, it's nothing short of a miracle that she survived. The doctor who applied stitching to her wounds was almost certain that there'd be permanent spinal damage, but aside from nicking a few minor nerve endings, the cleaning lady had somehow avoided any kind of life-changing injury. Once she was able, the police conducted an interview with the woman, who preferred not to be named in the media. She claimed that she couldn't get a good look at her attacker, but they didn't suspect that it was anyone she knew. However, the Good Samaritan who came to her aid was able to give a much more detailed description, stating that they were a bald Caucasian male of medium height and athletic build, between the ages of 25 to 35. The witness also stated that the attacker had been wearing sunglasses, a striped white and navy blue t-shirt, denim shorts, and white sneakers. While the identity of the attacker remains a mystery, one thing was abundantly clear. They hadn't attempted to engage in any kind of robbery or further violation, and no words were exchanged prior to the attack, meaning their sole intention had been to kill. In the weeks that followed, the local community was horrified by police reports suggesting the killer was motivated by perverse, antisocial impulses. The public was also gripped by the fact that the attack had been interrupted, and the Spanish media fueled their obsession with what might have happened had it been allowed to continue. The public's morbid obsession with the case generated a great outrage, leading to tens of thousands of euros being poured into the investigation. Yet despite an extensive hunt for the killer, no suspects were identified and no one was ever arrested. It's almost been 3 years since the random and savage attack, and in all likelihood, it's only a matter of time before someone so dangerously disturbed chooses to strike again. Torrevieja will prove rich pickings for a predator like that, being a place where people are only passing through for a short period of time. Perhaps true crime aficionados should keep an eye out on the town of Torrevieja, because next time, the knife-wielding maniac might just finish what he started. On January 2nd of 1935, a man calling himself Roland T. Owen checked himself into the Hotel President in Kansas City, Missouri. The receptionist who took Roland's reservation later described him as being in between his late 20s or early 30s, with brown hair and a scar over his right ear. He didn't appear to have any luggage in his possession and carried only a hairbrush, comb, and toothpaste in his pocket. Then, when it came to his choice of hotel room, Roland specifically asked for an interior room, several floors up. Roland was booked into room 1046, and he quickly ran into a young lady named Mary Soptic, who would be his maid for the duration of his stay. Roland gave her full permission to clean his room, asking only that she not lock the door behind her because he was waiting for a friend. Mary later noted that Roland kept the room's blinds tightly drawn, keeping the room dark aside from one small dim lamp. Other members of the hotel's staff noticed the same thing upon their visits to room 1046, and also observed that Roland seemed to be deathly afraid of something. At around 4 p.m. on the day Roland checked in, Mary Soptic returned to his room with some fresh towels, only to find him lying on the bed in pitch darkness. Mary wasn't sure if Roland was sleeping or not, but to be on the safe side, she crept over to the table, placed the towels down in silence, then exited the room again. Yet on her way out, she noticed a handwritten note on Roland's bedside table, and it read, "Dawn, I'll be back in 15 minutes. Wait." It seemed like an odd note for someone to write if they intended to have a nap, but things were about to get much, much stranger at the hotel president. The following day, Mary Soptic returned to Roland's room in order to clean it. She quickly noticed that the door had been locked from the outside and assumed Roland had locked it after he left. Using her own key, she unlocked the door and walked inside, but to her surprise, there was Roland, sitting in the darkness. After giving Mary permission to clean the room, Roland took a call on his hotel's phone. Mary later stated that he said, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I'm not hungry, I just had breakfast." Mary also said he repeated the phrase, "No, I'm not hungry," several times, to the point it started to sound very, very odd indeed. Still holding the phone, Roland began to ask Mary about her job as she continued to clean the room. She later mentioned how he wanted to know if she was responsible for the entire floor, and if the president was a residential hotel which housed long-term guests. Mary tried to be as helpful as possible, and answered all of Roland's questions as best she could. But still, she found his intense curiosity to be odd, especially considering that most of the hotel's guests chose never to talk to her at all. Later that evening, when Mary returned with more towels, she claimed to have heard 2 male voices coming from inside the room. When she knocked on the door, she heard a loud, deep voice ask, "Who is it?" Then she explained that she had fresh towels, and the voice replied, "We don't need any." Mary knew for certain that there wasn't a single towel in the room, dry or otherwise, as she had taken them herself in the morning. What's more, the responding voice didn't sound like Roland at all. Suspicious but not wanting to cause any trouble, Mary left the room alone. The next morning, one of the hotel's switchboard operators came on shift at 7 a.m., only to notice that Roland's phone had been off the hook for quite some time. Concerned for the guest's well-being, the operator then sent a bellboy to go check up on Roland to see if he needed any assistance. When the bellboy arrived at room 1046, he noticed it had a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door. However, given that he was under strict instructions to perform a welfare check, the boy knocked on the room several times before hearing a voice say, "Come in, turn on the lights." The boy tried but found the door was locked, and Roland seemed to ignore his request to unlock the room. Concluding that Roland was either drunk or half asleep, he decided to try again in an hour or so. Then, at around 8:30 a.m., the hotel's switchboard operator noticed that room 1046's phone was still off the hook, and sent another bellboy to the room in order to check on the guest. This bellboy, named Harold Pike, opened the room to find Roland lying naked on the bed. The phone was off the hook because it had been knocked to the ground somehow. So, assuming that Roland was indeed drunk, he replaced the phone's receiver, then crept out of the room again. Strangely, between 10:30 and 10:45 a.m., room 1046's phone again came off the receiver, and this time, the original bellboy was once again sent to investigate. By this time, the hotel's staff were growing irritated with Roland, who had already gained a reputation as being a rather annoying guest. The bellboy expected yet more inebriated antics on entering the room, yet the sight that greeted him was one of pure horror. On the floor in front of him was Roland's unconscious body, and almost every visible surface was drenched in blood. Quote, "When I entered the room, the man was within 2 feet of the door on his knees and elbows, holding his head in his hands," the boy later told police. "I saw blood on his head. I then turned the light on. I looked around and saw blood on the walls, on the bed, and in the bathroom. This frightened me, and I immediately left the room and went downstairs." The boy then fled downstairs to seek help, returning soon afterward with the hotel's assistant manager, and after a near-breathless Roland began to beg him for help, he rushed to summon medical aid. Dr. Harold Flanders of Kansas City General Hospital arrived soon after Roland was discovered, and was one of the first to witness the extent of his injuries. Ronald had his neck, wrists, and ankles all bound with cord. His neck had visible bruising and suggested someone had attempted to strangle him. He also had multiple stab wounds to his chest, with one wound dangerously close to his heart, while another had punctured his lung. Repeated blows to the right side of his head had rendered him with a serious skull fracture, and he had been struck so hard that there was blood spray on the ceiling of his hotel room. Dr. Flanders cut the cords from Roland's wrist and asked him who had done this to him, only to have Roland reply with one single word: "Nobody." Roland then claimed that he'd sustained his injuries after falling and hitting his head on the edge of the room's bathtub, and denied trying to take his own life when the subject was raised. Shortly afterwards, Roland lost consciousness and was completely comatose by the time he arrived at Kansas City General. Hospital staff fought hard to save his life, but sadly, Roland passed away shortly after midnight on January 5th of 1935. The coroner, who performed an autopsy on Roland, determined that he had died as a result of his wounds. His estimated time of death was logged as having occurred between 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, and aside from the tag on the necktie, which indicated it had been manufactured in New Jersey, there were no clues to Roland's identity or background. No knives were found at the scene of the crime, which led to the dismissal of him taking his own life as a cause of Roland's death, since the stab wounds in his chest could not be accounted for. The cords used to tie him suggested the involvement of others, and detectives found other items that were checked in as evidence, including a hairpin, a safety pin, an unsmoked cigarette, and a full bottle of diluted sulfuric acid. 4 fingerprints, small enough that detectives believed they had been a woman's, were found on the room's phone. These fingerprints could not be matched to Roland or to any of the hotel employees who had been known to have entered the room. It seemed obvious that someone had entered Roland's hotel room at some point during the early hours of the morning, but frustratingly, not a single member of hotel staff recalled seeing anyone during that period of the morning. With no fingerprint match and no witnesses, law enforcement was forced to seek help through the local media. But not only did the coverage not generate any credible leads, but no next of kin came forward to claim Roland's body. This is about the time police began to suspect that their murder victim wasn't actually named Roland T. Owen. His body was stored in a local funeral parlor for almost 2 months, and he only avoided an unceremonious, anonymous burial due to a mysterious donor financing his funeral at the last moment. This donor paid by wire transfer and had a floral arrangement delivered which bore a note saying, "Luis." For almost 18 months afterwards, the man's identity remained a complete enigma, until finally, an Alabama woman named Ruby Ogletree spotted a photo of a man in a newspaper, one who had a very distinctive scar above his right ear. Ruby came forward to identify the dead man as her son, Artemis Ogletree, who had been born in Florida back in 1915. He was one of 3 children, and during his childhood, an accident with some hot grease left a sizable scar on his head above his ear, which remained hairless afterward. According to his mother, Artemis was just 19 when he left Birmingham, Alabama to hitchhike to California. Years later, she received a number of letters from him, some from as far away as Egypt. Some of these letters requested money from her, and each time she obliged him. Then in August of 1935, Ruby claimed to have received a call from someone in Memphis, Tennessee. The man calling told her that Artemis had saved his life in a fight and that Artemis himself could not call because he was now happily settled in Cairo. The caller added that Artemis was unable to write to her because he had lost one of his thumbs in the same fight which had saved the caller's life. Ruby noted that the man spoke wildly and incoherently for over 30 minutes, and that according to the timeline of her son's death, all the letters had been sent post-mortem. It also emerged that Artemis had never been to Egypt, as records kept by shipping companies found no records that Artemis had ever visited the place. These same letters were connected to a murder which occurred in New York during 1937, but the investigation into the suspect quickly fell apart. However, one of the accused aliases was Donald Kelso, perhaps even the same Don that was being referred to in Artemis's note. Donald Kelso, whose real name was Joseph Martin, had been arrested for murder after he killed a man he shared a room with before shipping the body to Memphis in a trunk. According to a story about the case in the New Yorker, Kansas City police had matched samples of his handwriting to that in the letters written by Ruby Ogletree. However, no charges were filed against Martin in relation to Artemis's murder, and the KCPD kept the case open. The case files show that different detectives reviewed the murder every few years throughout the 1950s, but gradually, the case went cold. The absence of suspects in the case has inspired several different theories on who killed Artemis and why. There were telephone calls alleging that Roland was killed in retaliation for a broken engagement, and that he was having an affair with a woman who'd rather see him dead than in the arms of his wife. However, organized crime has also been considered, since Artemis seems somehow connected to Joseph Martin, the career criminal from New York City. Little is known about Martin or the shadowy criminal organization he represented, but some theories assign them as a great deal of power. Some theorize that the reason Artemis's killer remained invisible to the hotel staff was because his killer was a member of the hotel staff, and that whatever bloodthirsty group wanted Artemis dead were able to manipulate, intimidate, or pay off one of the staff members into murdering him. That explains why the killer was apparently able to lock Artemis's door from the outside, and why no one had seen any guests or outsiders moving around the hallways at the time of his murder. Sadly, this angle was completely neglected by law enforcement at the time, and not a single member of the hotel's staff was questioned aggressively in the aftermath. Perhaps if they had been, Artemis Ogletree's life and death wouldn't still be such a mystery, and perhaps his killer might have actually been brought to justice. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST, and super fun live streams on Sunday, Tuesdays, and Thursday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down below in the description. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to call your grandma.